Hello, welcome back to our UTOK book series. Today we're finishing up a section, right? Because we just did the pillars. We're closing out this section of the book with the evolution of UTOK. So how the system developed over a long period of time. So that's kind of exciting to talk about, a little storytelling.
Amen. That's right. So our three pillars are the tree of knowledge, then it turns into the garden and the I quad coin. Those are our three pillars. So here what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the history of all of that. And when, this thing evolves so you can see how it transpires. The beginning of this for me well, I should start with just the very fact that as an undergrad, I love psychology and I love science. And basically, in retrospect, I clearly identify as a behavioral scientist, meaning, I'm really interested in behavior. People have their experience of it, but I want to scientifically understand that, broadly defined. And then was a social cognitive. People like Bandura I thought were really, super impressive. And I was impressed with Beck and others that were like, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Let's position that in time. Around what year was that when
Right.
you were
Yeah, so
studying?
I go into undergrad in 1988 and graduate in 1991. It's during that time period. I know then I actually took a psychology course in high school and always sort of wanted to be a psychologist. So it was a long-term standing thing. And then I knew I wanted to become a clinician. And at the time, I was like, well, the social cognitive view is actually scientific, and the humanistic view is a little soft and whooshy and feminine, and the
The
psychoanalytic view is
classic
like,
divide, right?
kind of classic divide. And then nothing's happening to me other than I'm in my master's program, and then I get introduced to what's called psychotherapy integration. And that really is my home in many levels, in the sense that it's this idea that there is a thing called psychotherapy, like people can position themselves with knowledge, see the maladaptive and other kinds of psychological suffering that people engage in, systematize our approach, and help people. I believe in that. There's certainly truth to that. But what I realized then is that when I got into this idea that cognitive behavior therapy was clearly superior to humanistic or psychodynamic or any other major approaches was just wrong. That's not right. What is much more right is that actually there's a general healing process, and the common factors are much more robust than the specific competition between schools. So in other words, if you say, well, what are the common factors? And a good psychodynamic therapist will do better than a good CBT therapist, and vice versa. Okay. Than a worse CBT. It's really the quality of the therapy that can be approached from all these different angles. That's the common factors. And of course, you and I know this well, it ultimately evolve into the common core. And this is a retrospective analysis, but intuitively, it made sense to me that we didn't divide the world of psychotherapy into these brand name schools of thought. ACT, CBT, EFT, etc., which we get the brand name. What should happen, and again, I didn't realize this was a profound statement, ironically, but what should happen is there should have been a science of human psychology, and then that should have informed all the different therapeutic perspectives, in retrospect, much the way modern medicine informs all the different ways in which we think about illnesses and treatments. So in 1994, then, I realized what I would later then call the problem of psychotherapy. Okay. And I then zoomed out and then stumbled back into what I would then, again, not aware of at the time, the problem of psychology.
Let me just make a comment because it's really interesting to see the historical trajectory that you were on. Because sometimes we just don't know, like coming into the theory nowadays when it's pretty much complete, and it has all these ideas. We don't know exactly what led to the consequent things. And it's easy to see now with you telling the story that when you found out about the problem of psychotherapy and how, there's a process of healing, there are these general principles that are common to these different therapies. It's not about the brand, it's not about the specific paradigm necessarily, it's about the ontology of what's actually going on. It's like about the real process of psychotherapy that is happening, that is causing the healing. What are those real things in the world that's leading to that? So what's the ontology of what's happening? And then that
Love
directly ties into the problem of psychology, right? Because then you have a problem of the ontology of psychology. And then in comparison with all the other sciences, it's really, that sounds to me like that was your spark to think about, okay, what's really the thing that we're talking about when we talk about all these different theories in psychology, these different paradigms.
That's exactly right. That's the right lens. I didn't have that word at the time. I wouldn't have used the word ontology back in 1994. I just would have said, what is the science of psychology? What does it tell us about the reality? So I thought then that there should be a science that then specifies the domain of reality that we're talking about. And this now is the problem of psychology. I didn't realize that at the time, but actually psychology becomes a science not because it knows the domain of ontological reality, but in fact it has a method. I was a behavioral science. I learned the methods of statistics, ANOVA, all of that. That provides a lens to then carve out whatever the territory is. And then I had backed into what then now historically I realize is, or at least a good aspect of the crisis, okay, which is psychology is a different kind of science than all the other natural sciences. It tries to connect to the natural sciences, but it doesn't have an ontology. There's no clarifying view about our knowledge of reality that points to the domain of psychology and clarifies what it is, in direct contrast to like biology and the ontology of life. Biology is the science of life, and that's an ontological category. And chemistry is the ontology of the structure of matters, and physics and energy matter relations across space and time. Those are ontological, consensually agreed upon ontological reference. And that's the thing. I backed into evolutionary psychology because I knew I needed to be connected to some kind of ontology, and found in there some really cool things that were binding evolutionary theory to cognitive psychology models and all of that. But ultimately, it doesn't carve nature at its joints. In retrospect, it doesn't give us an ontology.
You wrote a couple of interesting blogs on that, right? How evolutionary theory is a really good paradigm and a necessary one, but not a complete meta theory for psychology. I'll link that in the description because it's super interesting.
Yeah. It doesn't define what psychology is and doesn't clarify mental versus behavioral elements. And the old mental, it just adopts cognitive psychology against behavioralism. 4E cognitive science actually is really coming back to behaviorism anyways. Whatever, it doesn't get it right. And then this gets us into really the beginning of UTOK, which is once I learned evolutionary psychology, bound the evolution of animal behavioral investments, which I would then come back and specify, and the evolution of mindedness, again, a term that I didn't have at the time, but I had intuitively. Then something happened with us as human primates that transformed us fundamentally. There was a fundamental joint point that created a complexity building feedback loop. My first great insight is that actually the problem of language creates a propositional language, not symbolic language, but symbolic syntactical proposition, which creates meaning statements that then can be questioned. And it is the capacity of question-answer dynamics that then generates the problem space of justification, which then is a generative complex adaptive space that builds systems of justification. And then I was like, oh, we humans have been built by evolution to be justifiers. And that insight says, at an individual level, it's like our egos are justifying systems to ourselves and have the audience of the private. And then we're public justifiers out here, and then we have to navigate other people's justification and influence system. And now all of a sudden I had a functional organization of higher order human person thinking on our animal insides and on our social reality outsides that explained the interpersonal dynamics and easily pointed to the sociological, anthropological, cultural layer that said, oh, what is culture? Systems of justification really nail that. And there's also technology. We can talk about that. But that was my great first idea. And that happened in 1996.
And it's really cool how directly related to real life that is, right? Because again, the real cool historical positioning of where you were, seeing clients entering into people's worlds and seeing how they justified, that put you in a prime spot, right, with what you were learning and the things you were doing in the world and your own personal history, right, and things that happen in your life. We can, when we learn about justifications, we sort of introspect and see that we're doing it too.
Totally.
And it's really cool to start noticing that. I remember doing that when I first learned about it. But it's really cool to see, how all of that you were learning systematically was informing that, but also what you were living in your life.
I love that.
And what you were seeing in your clients' lives too.
Right. You're making a tremendously important point here that was starting to evolve, and then my life would really take off in our next key insight. So this is so the problem formation, 1994, 1996, now all of a sudden the first key insight is I can separate humans, not just through language, but it's language into self-conscious reflection, into culture, right? And then I had the idea that I could then measure this, okay? And then I was going to experiment on it to then what? To scientifically justify the justification idea, okay? Now, this is why I'm super happy you honed in on this idea of seeing it everywhere, okay? Because at first it's a theory, and it takes me a little while really to sort this out, but then it's actually a vocabulary. And the reason it's a vocabulary is it just grips the process by which we're doing this. Look what we're doing now. We're justifying UTOK. Right? That's what we get together and do. We ask questions, we generate answers, we build systems of argument and rationalization and etc. across any number of analytic criteria, all the way from Plato to Freud rationalizations. But the system, I saw that. In other words, I would say now I didn't have the language. I went from a meta theory that I was going to test to a descriptive metaphysical concept that's allowed me to just see the world. It's like there's behavior and a theory behavior. What do you mean by behavior? There's justification and a theory. They actually allowed me to see justification and also realize that the theory I had was a different idea, but it connected and it networked it all. And ultimately, I would later discriminate justification hypothesis as the idea, the tripartite model as then the functional dynamic organization. Actually, map of mind would come along, and then the tree of knowledge would give us a descriptive metaphysics that says, oh, these are actually the terms that we should be using to clarify our vocabulary. Then we should network them together functionally and theoretically. I was on that journey.
That's so cool. I think that points to how real that was, right? How lived that was. I mean, you
Talk
just
about
saw
ontology,
the thing,
right?
saw
You
the
just
justification.
you can't
right.
unsee it. You can't unsee it.
And then, you mentioned lots of ideas. Just to clarify that justification systems theory, there's three parts to it, right? There's the justification hypothesis, which you mentioned, the updated tripartite model, which is how the justification systems informed our human consciousness, right? And our filtration systems between ego, our core animal self, and then persona that we project in the world, and then the culture person plane of existence as a whole new dimension of existence on top of our animal mindedness. So there's those three moving parts, and we're not here to talk about the theory specifically, but it's cool how in the moment, right, all the way back in the 90s, you had the realization that was just true. You started seeing it everywhere, and all of a sudden, like, even though, testing things and going to the lab room is really important, it's also the case that I imagine that became a lot more minimized.
Totally,
because saw how real that was in terms of a descriptive metaphysics.
Well, another way of saying this, and it's not a super formalized concept, but is that it's really ecological validity. Ecologic, like drop it into the real world of ecology, and people, does it when you go home to your significant other, when you're at a meeting, wherever you go, do you see this? And this became a generalizable descriptive phenomenon that had enormous ecological validity. Literally everywhere I went, I saw people justifying their actions. So it was tremendously valid in the observational realities I was in. And then it would give rise to the next things in terms of moving us along in terms of the history. The single most important night in UTOK, arguably, is the explosion of the tree of knowledge, the diagram behind me. I had pulled off then the culture person plane of existence, and then could see, if you multiply that times technology and track the evolution of human civilization, you now knew why it was that we humans occupied such a different space than the rest of the animal kingdom. What that also meant is then we could see human space relative to animal space. I was separating it up here, like up in the higher. That also meant that I had separated animal space mindedness from living organisms intuitively, like that was the structure. And of course, living organisms come off of material objects, all of which is then coming out of an emergent cosmic evolutionary Big Bang, and pow! The tree of knowledge, which I'm still just amazed at how much knowledge is in that one unfiltered insight moment. I mean, you can look at
I'm glad we framed it.
I'm glad we framed it. That's you, and put it up on our first monastery, my love.
Good
And
to
so
be
anyway,
sentimental sometimes, there's value in that.
hey, totally. I mean, I need to be compensated. It's a good opponent process. So then, and then talk about again, I didn't have the term, but a descriptive metaphysical system. I realized the tree of knowledge system. What kind of thing is it? It's a descriptive metaphysical system for first person, third person, and a second person knowing. In fact, that's what we're talking about with justification. So the tree of knowledge then pops and allows me to carve nature back to Aristotle, really, in his scales of nature are the four dimensions of behavioral complexification: matter, object, living organism, minded animal, and cultured person. And that sends me on my way to say there is a way. We have misframed psychology, so ontologically, meaning it's confused between the mind, brain, behavior, animal behavior system. Behaviorism, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology really grounds there. And then human psychology, which then are minded animals, are also cultured persons, nested then in the social contextual context. So human psychology is different than basic psychology. And then there is a description that would afford us clarity about psychotherapy. And now I could see what I was looking for through the tree of knowledge. That should have been handed to me, not some brand name of CBT or /ACT or psychodynamic. No, hand me the ontology of human behavior through this particular lens, and then from there work as a psychological doctor.
Yeah, and just good to point out that that's still the basic frame of what's handed out to students, right? I mean, when I went into psychology, that's what I received until I met UTOK. So that's why it's a problem of psychology and not a crisis, right? There's tons of literature on what they call the crisis of psychology, and there's a lot of overlap, but it really is a problem, right? That has not been solved until UTOK offered a solution, but it would institutional change is something different, but it's definitely the case that the institutions are
analytic solution, right? Then right, that's a whole other little side story. But so then Tree of Knowledge pops. That's 1997. Then from 1997 to 2003, I'm really then grappling with what this is and then making the argument. I consolidate. I had a vision for the influence matrix. I consolidate that, or at least the vast majority of it during this time. And the biggest other insight was I actually really learned Skinnerian behaviorism and realized that Skinner really had a framework that I didn't understand that really needed to bridge radical behaviorism, was a separate language technology than modern cognitive science. For good reason they were separate and couldn't be married, but UTOK's structure allowed me to, and I built behavioral. The operant dimension is where you go from living organisms into operating animals, that then the operant is the effect they have, and that's what Skinner's seen, really. Plants don't have much in the way of operant conditioning. Animals totally do, and that's what really makes them behave so different. They're operators, cognitive agents. Anyway, that gave rise to behavioral investment theory and the structure that allowed me to see traditional cognitive psychology in an evolutionary framework. Note, this is what evolutionary psychology doesn't do. And then bind it over to behaviorism, radical behaviorism, operant theory, and then nest that in a picture that affords clarity about the evolution of social construction reality, the culture person plane. That's another thing evolutionary psychology doesn't do, that there's actually a whole culture, evolutionary psychological culture mental module called the ego that sits there to justify, that gives rise to this whole socially constructed. I had this frame, and then I worked and built the Tree of Knowledge system, theoretical unification of psychology, bound that all, that was in 2003, got hired to work in the doctoral program so that I could be a professor guiding the approach that we were taking, and training psychological doctors. And ultimately, this really can be fast forward to 2011, and I produced the first book, which summarizes the unified theory of psychology, which now has a big picture, descriptive metaphysical frame. Again, I don't use that language there, but the Tree of Knowledge. Then there's a theory about how minded animals come out of living organism, behavioral investment theory, a theory about our sociology through influence matrix, and then a theory about how we're a cultured person. Those big three meta-theoretical constructs nested in a proper descriptive metaphysical system gives us the theoretical architecture that specifies the ontology, networks the theories together in a coherent whole, grounds us in a scientific epistemology, and gives us what I was looking for when I started this journey. So then, anyway, after the unified theory was built in 2011, I was directing the program, I went back to my original problem in 1994 and started the process from 2011 to 2016. We'd say, well, if it were the case that we had this architecture, where we could describe the big picture view of the tree of knowledge system, clarify behavioral investment theory, clarify the interpersonal process and socio-emotional dynamics of the influence matrix, and identify really human cognition as this justificatory process, higher order cognition. Now let's see what the world looks like. And then what emerged out of that is a network of ideas that then organized personality, character adaptation systems emerged out of that, which then says actually there's a habit system, there's an emotion experiential system, a relational system that evolves. Then on humans, there's a higher order justification, and then filtering between that at the defensive level. These are and then when you look at those systems, you're like, oh, those are the insights, right? Of behavioralism, habit, of emotion focused therapy, psychodynamic with relational and defense, and cognitive and existential, so that's CAST then emerged as sort of like the piecing together of the key insights through a meta-theoretical structure.
That's when you started going back to psychotherapy, right? It's interesting how you started in the clinic room, right? And then the questions that you asked at that time, mostly for yourself, right? You sort of wanted to figure that out for yourself so you could make sense of your work and the world. And then you answered those questions throughout the years, right? And you built the unified theory. And that was that scientific foundation that you needed to really understand what was going on, really, not just the metrics.
Ontologically scientific, right? Rather than epistemological.
Right.
I was taught that science was really epistemological justification. Actually, it's not. It's both onto-epistemological, and I was missing the ontology. So, yeah. Totally. That's the real scene.
And then you return then to reapply that. Okay, now that you have a good meta-theoretical scientific foundation to really understand what we call the GI dynamics, right, of what's going on. You have the cosmology and the tree of knowledge. You understand justification, understand the animal mindedness and the relationality. Then you apply that in the clinic room. And then CAST was the first idea that emerged.
Yep, and I wrote about that. Well, actually, these ideas were, I will say, emerging together. I tried to build a sort of like what became the unified approach to psychotherapy, and then that actually oriented me towards thinking about well-being. That really was the first idea, and the nested model of well-being I could then utilize and say, oh, actually, well, there is normative value in this concept, and they are nested in a socioecological context, and you're nested in a biopsychological, functional, structural architecture, and then you have a subject inside of there. And actually, the first thing I did was like, hey, what we're trying to do with psychotherapy is an applied professional task of improving well-being. What does well-being mean? And in the context of delineating well-being and thinking about how we help people, I realized I needed an assessment of the person's situation and maladaptive dynamics. And that resulted in the well-being screen and checkup system, which in turn oriented me to using the lens to map these different systems. And it was really through that process that CAST really popped. It's also the case that I'm teaching integrative psychotherapy across the years, which means I'm teaching psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, family systems approaches. And over the years, every time I have an iteration of teaching them, I'm refining the puzzle pieces and placing them in relation. So then that's 2015 or so, 14, 15, well-being is popping, CAST pops as this framework. And also then what are we doing? Well, people are trapped in maladaptive patterns, okay, and we're helping create awareness, acceptance, and adaptive change. That was my big three always. And then I read something on Dan Siegel, who had Cole, which says we're trying to enter into a mindful, reflective space rather than be reactive. We're being responsive mindfully, and we're being curious, open, accepting, and loving. I was also deeply steeped in ACT at that time, acceptance and commitment therapy, and the COM-MO flashlight popped. Wasn't a flashlight originally, but it was
grabbing my prop.
Yeah, the COM-MO approach. So I had then the basic technique to organize. Remember the common factors. Well, what are we doing? Well, we're trying to improve psychological well-being. Well, people have character adaptation systems and then developmental pathways. That's what became the wheel of development. They get trapped in problematic vicious loops. They don't know how to escape those, and they dig themselves in deeper. Psychotherapy is a process of stopping that reactivity, shifting, becoming reflective and responsive, and then gaining awareness through curiosity, acceptance, loving, having a loving, compassionate attitude, being motivated toward valued states of being. That's the contextual process of psychotherapy. That's what everyone really does try to do. If you nail it down to what's really going on.
Right.
What's
the bread and butter of like most conditions, most presentations, and
the neurotic conditions,
other things, right? When you get to personality, you get to neurodevelopmental stuff. That's different. But the core thing that pretty much
the common core
brings people in. That's that internalizing neurotic looping, right? And that's what CalmMO is totally geared toward. So I love that. I love that's where the whole journey of developing a unified theory culminates into this ameliorating well-being for people, reversing neurotic loops, and doing that good in the world in that professional manner.
And that brings us to 2016. That's where I thought it was going to end. I was going to launch a well-being initiative, tried to do that. We were going to assess college students. Hey, here's a model of psychology. Here's a model of psychotherapy, treating people about neurotic loops in CalmMO. And then, as we talked about last time, I think in the context, hey, I'm on a conference. I have this ATUA model, unified theory, unified approach. And then at a broad and general level, I'm hanging out with people that are trying to think big and cultivate disciplinary educational processes across international contexts. And how do we cultivate a globally sustainable self? And then really, I have the whole next phase. And that's really what we've been talking about, this whole book. And starts in 2016, where the next massive insight, which isn't at one night, but this is sort of, well, it's in response to this conference on and then it's this vision. Wait a minute, there's a landscape of knowledge here, and I'm intuitively drawn that the nature of the tree of knowledge says we're coming to a new transition point, the fifth joint point. There'll be new ways of knowing, new ways of organizing knowledge. I get the vision of the garden, and then you're really into the path of the garden. So that's from 2016, 2018, and the garden then coalesces as this. Essentially, think about the tree of knowledge coalescing into the unified theory, into the unified approach, and then the garden pops as this entire network of intersubjective, culturally collective, binding is and ought together in the kind of thing that would network our academic knowledge structures together. That's what the garden is, intersubjectively, both analytically and aspirationally. And then ultimately, I don't realize this, but I mentioned the word path. I then found from 2017, 2018, a path in relationship to that to bind the unique particular observer, the subject, this would be the coin, as the human identity function that then is relating to the intersubjective. And of course, this is going to get us our three vectors. And then that happens in 2018. I'm building a theory of knowledge society, and ultimately it's going to keep growing and then become this entire dynamic unified theory of knowledge in 2020, whereby we're getting this idea of, oh, there are these pillars. The tree of knowledge is grabbing one epistemological pillar. The garden is an intersubjective vector of knowing. The coin binds then the individual, unique, particular to it all. Then I can have a descriptive metaphysical system for third-person scientific knowing, first-person human phenomenology, and second-person cultural collectives. And that's then the journey of the unified theory of knowledge.
That's lovely. I mean, I just love, the nature of such a complex system is that those elements just started talking to one another, right? Without you necessarily wanting it. That's just what made sense given the puzzle pieces that you had. So that's kind of beautiful, right?
Yeah,
the fact that
that's a great
the system forms itself.
That's a great point. And I'll say, it's super important to understand the nature of the journey. It's much more like I got vacuumed into this than I set out to do it. My dad at one point said, oh, you started with justification. That's such a good idea. You could have been like Beck, but you wanted to do more. You wanted to, it's like, I didn't want to do more. Okay. It wasn't as if I had justification and then wasn't satisfied that this wasn't a big enough idea. I would have lived my entire life justification, been super happy and made whatever contributions I could in that. The nature of the problem that I backed into, which I now then we can characterize as the enlightenment gap, right, of the four problems. The enlightenment gap is through the problem of psychology. I was just zooming in, looking for, to use John Vervaeke, a relevance frame that I could realize my perceptions and actions within at the right level. And I'm just intuitively oriented to that. I happen to step into an epistemological enlightenment gap, onto epistemological enlightenment gap. that opened up when physics started really grasping a key vector of reality, but couldn't be aligned with subjective phenomenology or the cultural construction of knowledge. UTOK is this meta-psychology, philosophy of mind, science intersection that binds all that stuff together and says, oh, that was the puzzle, and now it's solved.
Right. It really was a rabbit hole that you fell into, and then you went through the journey, right, of finding that solution initially for yourself, and
right.
then the system just built itself in a way too, right?
Right. I realized that we're all mad here, right? A little down a little rabbit hole,
right.
You know. And then I realized there's a seed, a tree, and a Tina principle, and everything else that allowed me to have opportunities.
Even a dragon,
to see.
Right?
Even a dragon.
The dragon's lair.
Well, the whole part was helping people find people in the dragon's lair and rescue them and get them out. But anyway, that was the story. So it all started in 1994. Why not? Why shouldn't psychotherapy be bound to human psychology? Oh, I didn't know it at the time, but there wasn't any. Just into the tree of knowledge, split psychology across its proper ontological layers relative to natural science. That gives us a unified theory, and build that, go back, unified approach. Actually, that binds together sciences and humanities in a particular way. The garden emerges as a new kind of synthesis, scientific humanistic synthesis. The coin then binds the unique particular individual subject to both scientific and humanistic knowing. And there is the emergence of UTOK, Unified Theory of Knowledge.
That's beautiful. I'll ask one last question for us to wrap it up. How do you feel about this evolution? Is it ongoing? Could we hope for more developments that could change the core of the system? Do you feel it's complete? Do you feel like it's ever evolving? And I know that's a complex answer.
Right, that's a great, the answer sort of is both. There's definitely a phase completion here with the unified theory of knowledge, and it's binding together of the objective, subjective, intersubjective in a transjective whole. That's now done, and that really was the project, and that is my project. So at some level, in terms of the puzzle pieces of the engineering knowledge abstraction, the work that I've done by myself is done. Now the question is, what is this thing and how does it relate to the world? So it's a much more pragmatic, exploratory, how do we help people learn it, embody it, share it? What's the best framing to get people to see what it is that's happened? And I suck at all that. I need a lot of help in this phase. I'm definitely a rabbit hole theorist. I'm not a marketer. I don't know how to get, and that's what I'm trying to do. It's like, okay, and our journey together, and then connecting with other people. It's like, hey, what is this thing? How is this thing going to get metabolized by society in a way that can actually contact the current institution and then sort of make sort of change in relationship to that. A long process. In fact, my soul has been reoriented to the back half of the 21st century. This is a long marathon game I'm in. But really, I definitely see this more as sort of like a shift into binding folks together, getting feedback, kind of a marketing angle, evolve it across many different, and let people really start to digest it so its collective potential can be realized. That's what I see it growing as. That's what I really hope. And if actually it's going to make any difference in the little human universe, that needs to happen, or else it'll just be a tiny little ripple in the cosmos.
Beautiful. So it's a time of expansion, right, and refinement. Last thing I wanted to point out is that there's developments that do refine the theory. For example, the new work on consciousness that's being developed that is going to be showcased in the conference this year in April. And those refinements still happen, right? So there's refinement and there's expansion. And that core of the system is in many ways complete, right?
Totally.
But not in a rigid manner,
well,
definitely in an open and curious manner.
Right. So really super important just to what is this thing? Some final unified theory like the people talk about, a search of a final theory. That's not what UTOK actually is. It's not foundational. It's not way. So we're constantly growing. But my little space around this enlightenment gap, which by the way is huge and relevant for Western knowledge, does get completed here locally. And then it will continue to evolve and grow, both at the refined level and at the popular level, for sure. It just feels like if you look at the puzzle pieces, do feel like they've more or less fallen in place. That's essentially what I meant in the nature of the kind of justification system it is.
All right, beautiful.
All right.
Well, that was fun. It's nice to hear your story. And I'm looking forward to next time.
Thanks for guiding me through it very much. We'll see you next time.